Blood painted the frozen wasteland crimson as Kael the Destroyer stood atop a mountain of vanquished foes. His massive war axe dripped with the essence of defeated S-rank warriors, each one having fallen before his overwhelming might. The barbarian's breath created clouds of mist in the frigid air, his bare chest covered in scars that told stories of 1,000 battles won through pure, unrelenting physical dominance. At 32 years old, Kael had achieved what countless warriors spent lifetimes pursuing. The glowing SSS rank insignia on his right arm pulsed with crimson energy, marking him as one of the 10 most powerful fighters in the entire Northern Wastes. His reputation preceded him like a tidal wave. When Kael the Destroyer walked into a room, legendary warriors lowered their eyes. When he spoke, which was rare, kingdoms listened. When he fought, the earth itself seemed to tremble in anticipation of the violence to come. But Kael wasn't a thinker. He'd never needed to be. His world operated on simple, beautiful principles. You were strong, or you were weak. You won, or you died. Complex strategies, political maneuvering, verbal negotiations, these were tools for those too feeble to simply take what they wanted through strength. Kael's entire philosophy could be summarized in a single brutal truth: might makes right. That fateful morning started like any other. Kael had just finished decimating the Iron Fang Guild, a group of A-rank mercenaries who'd made the fatal mistake of accepting a contract on his head. Their leader, a supposedly brilliant tactician, had devised what he called an unbeatable strategy involving magical traps, coordinated attacks, and psychological warfare. Kael had responded by walking directly through their trap, ignoring their coordinated assault, and crushing their leader's skull with his bare hands, while the man was still mid-speech about surrender terms. As the last of the Iron Fang Guild scattered into the wastes, Kael noticed something strange. A crack in reality itself, shimmering like heat waves in the frozen air. It pulsed with colors he'd never seen before, swirling in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Most warriors would have approached with caution, analyzing the threat, gathering information. Kael did what Kael always did. He walked straight toward it, confident that whatever waited on the other side could be solved with his fists. The moment he stepped through, everything he knew about the universe shattered. The transition hit him like a physical blow, which was saying something for a man who'd been struck by dragon tails and lived. His body convulsed as reality twisted around him, pulling him through dimensions that shouldn't exist, showing him fragments of worlds beyond comprehension. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 eternities. Kael experienced what it meant to be unmade and remade. Then he crashed face first into polished marble floor. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Instead of blood and steel and the sharp tang of combat, the air carried scents of parchment, ink, and something floral he couldn't identify. The second thing he noticed was the silence. Not the silence of a pre-battle calm, but a complete absence of the sounds of combat that had formed the soundtrack to his entire existence. Kael pushed himself up, his muscles responding with their usual explosive power. He stood in what appeared to be an enormous hall, far larger than any structure in the Northern Wastes. The walls stretched up at least 50 feet, covered in tapestries depicting not battles or conquered territories, but people locked in what looked like conversations. The marble beneath his feet gleamed with an unnatural perfection, reflecting his barbaric appearance like a still lake. But what truly caught his attention were the people. Dozens of young individuals stood frozen, staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to horror to poorly concealed amusement. They wore flowing robes of various colors, each garment seeming to shimmer with its own internal light. Not battle armor, not practical clothing. Decorative robes that would get you killed in seconds during any real fight. And they were all holding books. A young man with silver hair and robes the color of midnight stepped forward, his posture radiating what Kael recognized as authority. Unlike the others, his expression showed no fear, only a calculating interest that Kael found mildly irritating. This one was analyzing him, weighing him, judging him. Kael decided he didn't like him. The silver-haired man's lips moved, forming words in a language that should have been incomprehensible. Yet somehow, impossibly, Kael understood every syllable. Well, it seems the Dimensional Academy has received an unexpected student. Tell me, Barbarian, do you even comprehend where you've landed? This is the Apex Academy of Rhetorical Arts, the most prestigious institution in all the Central Kingdoms. This is a place where power is not measured by the strength of one's arm, but by the eloquence of one's speech. Where battles are won not with axes and swords, but with words carefully chosen and precisely deployed. Kael stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed, a booming sound that echoed off the high ceiling. Words? He flexed his massive arms, each muscle group clearly defined after a lifetime of brutal training. You think words have power? I'll show you power. He took a step toward the silver-haired man, intending to grab him by those ridiculous robes and shake some sense into him. But before Kael could close the distance, the young man spoke a single phrase in a language that seemed to resonate with the air itself. Freeze where you stand, crude one, for your aggression reveals the weakness of your position. The words hit Kael like a physical force. His body locked in place, muscles straining against invisible bonds that held him as surely as iron chains. Panic, an emotion Kael rarely experienced, flickered in his chest. He pushed harder, calling on the immense strength that had made him an SSS-Rank warrior. His muscles bulged, veins stood out on his neck. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Nothing. He couldn't move even an inch. The silver-haired man circled him slowly, like a predator examining trapped prey. Fascinating. Such raw physical power, yet completely ineffective here. You see, Barbarian, in this world, your muscles mean nothing. Your battle scars tell no stories worth hearing. That SSS rank insignia on your arm? He tapped it with one finger, and Kael felt the mark burning, changing. It has no meaning here. In the rhetorical arts, rank is earned through mastery of language, through the ability to persuade, to argue, to debate, to verbally dismantle your opponent's position until they have no choice but to concede defeat. Kael watched in horror as his SSS rank mark faded, the crimson energy draining away until only a faint F rank symbol remained. F rank, the lowest of the low. The mark given to those who'd barely begun their journey toward power. No, Kael growled, his voice filled with rage. I am Kael the Destroyer. I have crushed armies. I have slain dragons. I have earned my rank through blood and battle. The silver-haired man smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps in your primitive world. But here you are nothing but a brute who hasn't even mastered the most basic principle of rhetorical combat. Let me demonstrate why your objection holds no weight. He turned to address the gathered students, his voice rising with practiced ease. Fellow scholars, observe this specimen. He claims to have earned power through violence, yet fails to recognize that true power comes from the mind. His argument rests on the foundation of physical achievement, yet he stands in a realm where such achievements are meaningless. Therefore, his claim to rank is built upon premises that do not apply to our reality. His conclusion is logically invalid. A system notification appeared in Kael's vision, something that had never happened before. Verbal combat lost logical fallacy, identified, appeal to irrelevant authority rank. Remains, F opponent, Lysander Ashcroft, A rank orator. The invisible bonds released Kael suddenly, causing him to stumble forward. Humiliation burned in his chest, hotter than any physical wound. He'd just been defeated without his opponent even raising a hand. Defeated by words, by arguments, by logic. An elderly woman approached, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her robes marked with 7 golden stars indicating advanced mastery. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made even Lysander step back. That will be sufficient, Ashcroft. Return to your studies. She turned to Kael, examining him with eyes that seemed to see through his very soul. You are clearly displaced, young man. The dimensional rifts have been unstable of late. I am Headmaster Cordelia Vermilion, and I offer you a choice. You may attempt to find your way back to wherever you came from, wandering our world as a F-rank outcast, with no understanding of how power functions here. Or, Kael forced the word out through gritted teeth. Or you may become a student at this academy, learn the rhetorical arts, discover that the human mind is the ultimate weapon, sharper than any blade, more powerful than any magic. Perhaps if you apply yourself, you might even regain something resembling the rank you once held. Though I warn you, the path will not be easy for one so physically oriented. Kael wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at him to reject this madness, to find whoever was responsible for his displacement and beat the truth out of them. But the mark on his arm, that damned F-rank symbol, reminded him of his current reality. He had no idea where he was, no understanding of this world's rules, no way to leverage his strength. He'd been reduced to nothing. I accept, Kael growled, but know this, Headmaster. I will not remain F-rank forever. I will climb back to SSS rank, using whatever methods this insane world demands. And when I do, I'll find a way home. Headmaster Vermilion's expression softened slightly, the ghost of a smile playing at her lips. Admirable determination, if misguided in its particulars. Very well. You shall be enrolled as a first-year student in the Foundation of Rhetoric course. Classes begin at dawn. I suggest you use the remaining hours to familiarize yourself with the student handbook. It contains the basic rules of verbal combat, the ranking system, and the penalties for physical violence on academy grounds. Penalties? Kael asked suspiciously. Immediate expulsion and permanent rank reduction to Z rank, a classification reserved for those who have completely failed to grasp the fundamental principles of civilized discourse. You see, Mr. Destroyer, violence is the resort of the incompetent mind. Here we value something far more precious, the ability to win without landing a single blow. As Headmaster Vermilion walked away, Kael stood alone in the grand hall, surrounded by whispering students who'd witnessed his humiliation. Their words created a cacophony of judgment, each comment another small cut to his pride. Did you see how easily Lysander defeated him? Barbarians have no place in an academy of higher learning. I give him 3 days before he quits in frustration. That F-rank mark suits him perfectly. Kael's fists clenched and unclenched uselessly at his sides. In his old world, these insults would have been answered with immediate violence. But here, violence would only prove their point, only reinforce his status as a mindless brute. He forced himself to stand still, to endure the whispers, to learn the first bitter lesson of this new existence. Strength wasn't just about muscles anymore. A small figure detached from the crowd, approaching Kael with a hesitant but kind expression. She stood barely 5 feet tall, with auburn hair tied in a practical braid and robes colored forest green. Unlike the others, her eyes held sympathy rather than mockery. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm Mira Thornwood, C-rank apprentice orator. I saw what happened, and I wanted to say, well, I think Lysander was being unnecessarily cruel. The transition is hard for everyone, even those of us who come from worlds similar to this one. I can't imagine how disorienting it must be for someone from a combat-focused dimension." Kael looked down at her, confusion mixing with his anger. "Why are you helping me? I'm nothing here. F-rank trash." Mira's expression firmed, her voice taking on a tone that reminded Kael of battlefield commanders before important speeches. "Because rank isn't fixed, it's earned. Because everyone deserves a fair chance to learn. And because—" She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Because I believe that someone with your level of determination in one discipline can transfer that same dedication to another. The question is whether you're willing to truly learn, or whether your pride will keep you trapped in F-rank forever." The statement hung in the air between them, a challenge wrapped in kindness. Kael realized he was being offered more than just help. He was being offered a perspective shift, except that his old methods wouldn't work here, or remain powerless. "What do I need to do?" he asked, the question itself feeling like a defeat. Mira's smile brightened considerably. "First, we get you to the dormitories and find you proper attire. Those battle scars and warrior garb will only make you a target for more aggressive debaters. Then we start with the absolute basics. Can you read in this world's language?" "I understand the words when I hear them. But written text?" Kael trailed off, embarrassment coloring his voice. "Illiterate in the written word, but fluent in spoken language. That's actually not uncommon for cross-dimensional students. The translation magic affects auditory processing, but not visual. We'll need to get you into remedial reading courses before you can even begin proper rhetorical training." The magnitude of how far he'd fallen crashed over Kael like an avalanche. Not only was he F-rank, not only had he been defeated without landing a blow, but he couldn't even read the textbooks that would teach him how to improve. In his world, he'd been a legendary warrior. Here, he was worse than a beginner. He was handicapped. Mira seemed to sense his spiraling thoughts. She placed a small hand on his massive forearm, the gesture absurdly tiny against his battle-hardened physique. "Hey, listen to me. I know this seems impossible right now, but the rhetorical arts have a saying. The mightiest fortress begins with a single well-placed word. You just need to find your first word, then build from there." Kael looked at her, this small woman who showed him more compassion in 5 minutes than most warriors had shown him in years. Something in his chest, a part he'd thought long dead from decades of brutal combat, stirred with an unfamiliar warmth. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the tiniest ember of possibility that he could rebuild himself from these ashes. "All right, Mira Thornwood, C-rank apprentice orator. Teach me about words." The dormitory room Mira led him to was modest but comfortable, a stark contrast to the war camps and mountain caves Kael had called home for most of his adult life. A bed with actual sheets, a desk carved from rich mahogany, shelves waiting to be filled with books, and a window overlooking sprawling academy grounds where students walked in small groups, their lips moving in constant conversation and debate. Mira produced a slim volume from her dimensional storage pouch, handing it to Kael with the reverence usually reserved for sacred weapons. "This is First Principles of Rhetorical Combat by Master Aldrich the Eloquent. It's considered the foundational text for all students of the verbal arts. I've marked several passages that might help you understand what you're facing here." Kael took the book, its leather binding soft and well-worn. Opening to a marked page, he stared at symbols that swirled and shifted before his eyes, gradually resolving into comprehensible text as the translation magic struggled to adapt. Reading was slow, laborious, but the words eventually made sense. "The 3 pillars of rhetorical combat," he read aloud, his deep voice stumbling over the unfamiliar academic language. "Ethos, the establishment of credibility and authority. Pathos, the evocation of emotional response. Logos, the deployment of logical argument and evidence. When a practitioner masters all 3 pillars, they can construct verbal attacks capable of reducing even the most fortified position to rubble." Mira nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Now read the next section, about how rhetorical combat actually works in practice." Kael's eyes tracked across the page, his reading speed painful even to himself. In a formal verbal duel, opponents face each other in designated combat zones called arenas of discourse. Each participant is allowed opening statements to establish their position. Following this, they engage in exchanges called volleys, where arguments are presented and countered. Victory is achieved when one's opponent concedes, when judges rule in your favor, or when your opponent commits 3 sequential logical fallacies. He looked up from the book, confusion evident. "This sounds nothing like actual combat." "Because it's not physical combat. Mira explained patiently. It's mental warfare. When Lysander spoke that phrase earlier, he wasn't just saying words randomly. He constructed an argument that, 1, established his authority in this space, 2, pointed out the logical flaw in your position, and 3, concluded with a directive you were compelled to follow. The magic of this world responds to well-constructed arguments. The better your rhetoric, the stronger the binding force of your words. Kael set the book down, his mind struggling to process this fundamental shift in how reality operated. So if I want to move up from F rank, I need to win these verbal duels, construct these arguments, use logic instead of strength. Precisely. Rank advancement works on a point system. F-rank students need to accumulate 100 victory points to advance to E rank. Each one duel against an equal-ranked opponent awards 10 points. Defeating someone higher ranked gives more points, but losing costs you points. Most students spend 6 months to a year at F-rank before advancing. 6 months to a year? Kael's voice rose with disbelief. I claimed SSS rank in the Northern Wastes in 5 years. Mira's expression turned serious. That's because you were playing to your strengths. Physical combat, endurance, raw power. These came naturally to you. Here, you're learning an entirely new discipline from scratch. And unlike physical training where you can simply practice forms and build muscle, rhetorical combat requires understanding theory, recognizing patterns, analyzing arguments in real time, and constructing counterpositions while under pressure. It's mentally exhausting in ways that physical combat never was. Kael sank onto the bed, which creaked under his considerable weight. The room suddenly felt suffocatingly small, the walls closing in like a prison cell. He'd traded a world where he understood every rule, where he'd mastered the game, for one where he was hopelessly outmatched and fundamentally unprepared. A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Mira answered, revealing a young man with neat brown hair and scholarly spectacles, carrying a stack of additional books and wearing robes marked with a D-rank insignia. Ah, Mira, there you are, the newcomer said, his voice carrying the precise enunciation of someone who'd spent years training in proper elocution. Headmaster Vermilion asked me to deliver supplementary materials to the new cross-dimensional student. I'm presuming this is him? Kael, this is Damien Hartwell, one of the teaching assistants for the Foundation of Rhetoric course. Damien, meet Kael the Destroyer. Just Kael. Damien's eyes traveled over Kael's imposing form with academic interest rather than fear or judgment. Fascinating. A physical combat specialist forced to adapt to verbal warfare. This will make an excellent case study. Tell me, Kael, in your previous world, did you engage in any form of strategic planning, long-term tactical thinking, analysis of opponent weaknesses? Kael considered the question. When facing multiple enemies, I identified the strongest first, eliminated them to break group morale, then worked through the remainder in order of threat level. Against single powerful opponents, I observed fighting patterns, identified defensive gaps, and exploited them with overwhelming force. Damien's expression brightened considerably. Excellent! Then you already possess foundational strategic thinking. The challenge will be translating that combat analysis into rhetorical analysis. Instead of physical weaknesses, you'll identify logical weaknesses. Instead of defensive gaps, you'll spot argumentative inconsistencies. The core skill, systematic analysis under pressure, transfers directly. For the first time since arriving in this strange world, Kael felt a spark of something other than rage or despair. Could his combat experience actually be relevant here? Could the instincts honed through thousands of battles apply to verbal duels? I've brought several introductory texts, Damien continued, setting the books on the desk. Starting with basic logical fallacies and how to recognize them, Introduction to Argument Construction, and The Fundamentals of Persuasive Speaking. I suggest beginning with the fallacies text. If you can identify when your opponent makes a logical error, you gain immediate advantage in any duel. Mira added, And tomorrow morning, before classes officially begin, I can walk you through the Academy's practice arenas. You'll need to understand the environment where most low-rank duels take place. Kael looked between these two students, neither of whom had any obligation to help him, both offering assistance freely. In the Northern Wastes, such kindness usually came with strings attached, hidden agendas, or ulterior motives. But here, facing these scholars who genuinely seemed to want him to succeed, he felt something unfamiliar stirring. Gratitude. "Why are you both helping me?" he asked bluntly. "What do you gain from assisting an F-rank barbarian?" Damien adjusted his spectacles, considering the question with visible seriousness. "From a practical standpoint, helping you succeed reflects well on our teaching abilities, which factors into our own rank advancement. From a philosophical standpoint, I believe knowledge should be shared freely, as it benefits the entire academic community when more individuals achieve mastery. And from a personal standpoint," he paused, a slight smile crossing his face, "I find your situation genuinely interesting. Cross-dimensional students are rare, and those from pure combat backgrounds even rarer. I'm curious to see if my theory about transferable strategic skills holds true." Mira's answer came simpler and more direct. "Because you looked like you needed help, and I was in a position to offer it. Sometimes the reason is just that straightforward." Kael absorbed this, struggling with concepts that felt alien to his worldview. In battle, you helped allies because you needed their swords beside yours. You invested in others when it provided tactical advantage. But helping simply because someone needed it? That was the sort of thinking that got warriors killed. Yet here he was, in a world where warriors could be killed with words alone. Maybe the old rules truly didn't apply. "Then I accept your help," Kael said formally, "and I will repay this debt." Damien waved dismissively. "No debt required, just don't squander the opportunity. The Foundation of Rhetoric course has a 40% failure rate in the first month. Many students, particularly those from more action-oriented backgrounds, find the transition impossible and drop out. If you're truly committed to reclaiming SSS rank status, which I should mention is held by only 15 people in this entire world, you'll need to dedicate yourself completely to linguistic mastery." After Damien left, and Mira departed for her own evening studies, Kael sat alone with the stack of books. He opened Basic Logical Fallacies and How to Recognize Them, forcing his eyes to track across each line, his mind to absorb each concept. Ad hominem. Attacking the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. Example. You can't trust his position on combat strategy because he's never won a battle. This fallacy attempts to undermine credibility rather than address the actual logical content. Kael paused. Hadn't that been exactly what Lysander had done to him? Attacked his credibility as a crude barbarian rather than actually addressing whether physical strength could have value? Yet somehow Lysander's argument had worked, had bound him in place, had reduced his rank. He continued reading into the early hours of morning, his eyes burning from the effort of decoding unfamiliar text, his head pounding from processing entirely new frameworks of thought. But slowly, painfully, patterns began to emerge. Arguments had structures, like sword forms. Logical progressions followed rules, like combat sequences. Fallacies created openings, like defensive weaknesses. Maybe, just maybe, he could learn this. Dawn arrived with gentle light filtering through his window, so different from the harsh red sunrises of the northern wastes. Kael had managed perhaps 2 hours of sleep, his mind too active, too flooded with new information to rest properly. But years of combat training had taught him to function on minimal sleep, and he rose with the grim determination of a soldier preparing for battle. True to her word, Mira appeared at his door shortly after sunrise, accompanied by a plain gray robe. "Academy uniform," she explained. "Your warrior garb will draw too much attention, and not the productive kind. Trust me on this." Kael accepted the robe reluctantly, changing in privacy and emerging to find the fabric strange against his scarred skin. Where his old clothing had been designed for maximum mobility during combat, this robe prioritized appearance and traditional academic presentation. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he'd removed essential armor before walking into battle. "How do you feel?" Mira asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. "Like I'm about to fight naked," Kael admitted. She laughed, a musical sound that seemed out of place in his grim mental landscape. "Perfect analogy, actually. In verbal combat, you are exposed. Your thoughts, your logic, your ability to think clearly under pressure, all of it becomes visible to your opponent and any observers. There's nowhere to hide behind physical prowess or intimidating presence." They walked through the academy's winding corridors, passing groups of students already engaged in animated discussions. Kael noticed how they gestured as they spoke, how their voices rose and fell with practiced rhythm, how they seemed to be constantly practicing, refining, honing their linguistic skills even in casual conversation. The practice arenas occupied an entire wing of the academy, divided into smaller chambers for different rank levels. Mira led him to the F-rank section, a modest room with simple wooden platforms where new students could face each other without the pressure of higher-ranked observers. "This is where you'll spend most of your first few months," Mira explained. "F-rank duels follow simplified rules to help students learn the basics: 20-minute time limits, 3 volley minimum, and judges who will explain what went wrong if you lose. It's designed to be educational rather than just competitive." The room already contained several other students, each wearing robes marked with the distinctive F-rank symbol. They eyed Kael with various expressions: curiosity, dismissal, nervousness at his imposing physical presence. One figure in particular caught his attention: a lithe young man with dark skin and confident posture who stood apart from the others, radiating the quiet assurance of someone who knew they wouldn't remain F-rank for long. This young man approached directly, his movement graceful and purposeful. "You're the cross-dimensional barbarian everyone's talking about. The one who got absolutely destroyed by Lysander Ashcroft yesterday." Kael bristled at the casual mention of his humiliation, but forced himself to respond with words rather than his fists. "I am. And you are?" "Cassius Nightshade. I've been F-rank for exactly 2 weeks, during which time I've won 15 duels and lost 2. I'll be advancing to E-rank within the month." His tone carried absolute certainty, not arrogance but simple statement of fact. "I'm told you're from a world of physical combat. That must make this transition particularly brutal." "It has its challenges," Kael said carefully, unsure where this conversation was heading. Cassius's expression shifted to something almost predatory. "I propose a practice duel. Right now, you need experience in actual verbal combat, and I need to maintain my winning streak before advancement. We both gain something. You get practical exposure to dueling protocols, and I get another victory on my record." Mira started to object. "Kael hasn't even attended his first class yet. This isn't fair." But Kael cut her off. "I accept." Every instinct screamed that he was about to be humiliated again. But how else would he learn? Studying theory in books could only take him so far. At some point, he needed to step into the arena, however poorly prepared he might be. Cassius's smile widened. "Excellent. A voluntary duel requires a F-rank arbiter present. Mira, since you're C-rank, you don't qualify. We'll need to pull in one of the teaching assistants." Within minutes, they'd secured an F-rank arbiter, a nervous-looking student named Thomas, who seemed far more interested in his textbook than in officiating duels. Nevertheless, he activated the arena's magical recording system and took his position at the neutral podium. "This is an official practice duel between F-rank students Cassius Nightshade and Kael, no surname listed, the Destroyer." Thomas looked up from his notes with visible confusion. "Just Kael," the barbarian growled. "Right, just Kael. Standard F-rank rules apply. 20-minute duration, minimum 3 volleys, victory conditions are concession, judges ruling, or 3 sequential logical fallacies. Combatants, take your positions." Kael and Cassius stepped onto opposing platforms, facing each other across 10 feet of empty space. The magical field activated, creating a shimmering barrier that would prevent physical contact, but allow words to pass freely. Thomas raised his hand. "Opening statements may begin. Cassius Nightshade, as the challenger, you have the floor." Cassius's entire demeanor shifted. Gone was the casual confidence, replaced by intense focus and precise control. When he spoke, his voice carried a power that Kael could almost feel physically. "I stand before this arena with a proposition that cannot be refuted through reason or logic. Physical strength, the domain from which my opponent originates, represents humanity's most primitive approach to problem-solving. It is the tool of those who lack the intellectual capacity to construct nuanced arguments, the fallback position of minds unable to engage with complexity. My opponent's very presence in this arena proves my point. He arrives from a world so intellectually bankrupt that it values muscle over mind, force over philosophy. Therefore, any position he attempts to defend here is fundamentally undermined by the system from which he originates. I have established not only my ethos as one who understands the superiority of rhetorical combat, but also the logos demonstrating why physical strength is an inferior method of conflict resolution. I rest my opening." The words hit Kael like invisible blows, each sentence a carefully constructed attack. He could feel the magic responding to Cassius's rhetoric, could sense the argument's structure even if he didn't fully understand its mechanics. The notification appeared. "Cassius Nightshade has established strong opening position, ethos, credible logos, structurally sound pathos, minimal but present your stidian. Response required within 90 seconds, 90 seconds. Less than 2 minutes to counter an argument he barely understood, using skills he'd just begun learning. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but Kael forced it down through sheer discipline. He'd faced impossible odds before. He'd stood alone against enemy armies. He'd battled creatures that defied natural law. He could do this. Kael's voice, when he spoke, lacked Cassius's polish and refinement. But it carried something else. Raw authenticity forged through decades of genuine combat experience. "You claim physical strength is primitive, but I have seen the most complex strategies crumble when faced with overwhelming force. I have watched brilliant tacticians die because their plans could not account for the unpredictable nature of true battle. Yes, I come from a world that values strength. But that world produced warriors who could make split-second decisions while arrows flew and swords clashed, who could read an opponent's intentions from the smallest body movement, who could calculate trajectories and timing while fighting for their lives. If you think such abilities are primitive, you have never truly been tested. You speak of intellectual capacity from the safety of an academy, but have you ever needed to think clearly while facing your own death? I may not know your rhetorical forms yet, but I know something you apparently don't. Real strength comes from being tested by reality itself, not from winning debates in controlled environments." The notification updated. "Partial counter achieved ethos, moderate credibility, established logos. Argument shifts topic, but shows critical thinking. Pathos, strong emotional appeal. Warning. Response does not directly address opponent's core premise." Thomas marked something on his evaluation sheet. Cassius's expression showed a flash of surprise, quickly masked, before he responded. "My opponent makes a classic appeal to emotion fallacy, attempting to substitute genuine logic with dramatic imagery of battlefield experiences. The question is not whether warriors must think quickly. I grant that they do. The question is whether physical violence represents an optimal solution to conflicts when superior alternatives exist. His entire response fails to address my central claim. that rhetorical combat is demonstrably superior to physical combat because it achieves resolution without the needless destruction and loss of life inherent to martial conflict. Furthermore, he commits the false equivalence fallacy by suggesting that battlefield decision-making equates to rhetorical analysis. These are fundamentally different cognitive processes requiring different skill sets. I have not only maintained my position, but exposed critical flaws in his counter-argument. I rest my first volley. Cassius Nightshade has identified two logical fallacies. Your position weakening, required response time. 60 seconds now. The arena's magic was penalizing him for his weak previous response. Kael's mind raced, searching through the limited knowledge he'd absorbed from the previous night's reading. Fallacies. Cassius was claiming fallacies in his argument. But if he was using fallacies, wasn't Cassius also vulnerable to them? Think. What had the book said? Ad hominem, straw man, false dilemma. Which ones applied here? You claim I commit fallacies, Kael began, speaking more slowly to buy time to formulate his thoughts. But you build your entire position on a false dilemma, the assumption that physical and rhetorical combat are mutually exclusive, that society must choose one over the other. My world values both. A general who cannot fight is useless on the battlefield, but so is a warrior who cannot plan. You also commit the hasty generalization fallacy by taking my specific example of battlefield thinking and dismissing all physical strength as primitive based on that single instance. Your logic has holes large enough to march an army through. The notification flashed. Fallacy identification. Successful argument beginning to stabilize. Continue current approach. Cassius's confident expression faltered slightly. He'd expected Kael to crumble, to be overwhelmed by superior rhetorical training. Instead, the barbarian was learning, adapting, finding patterns even in this first real duel. An interesting counter, Cassius admitted, his voice maintaining its formal debate tone. However, you misrepresent my position. I never claimed the two forms of combat are mutually exclusive in their existence, only in their relative merit and effectiveness. Nor did I generalize from your single example. I applied a logical principle that violence inherently causes more harm than verbal resolution. These are not fallacies but legitimate points of argumentation that you are attempting to deflect through mislabeling. Your lack of formal training shows clearly in your inability to distinguish between actual fallacies and disagreement with underlying premises. Cassius Nightshade defends against fallacy accusations. Duel continues. Next volley beginning. The match continued for the full 20 minutes, each exchange pushing Kael to the absolute limits of his newly developing abilities. He lost. Of course he lost. The judges ruled 3 fallacies against him to only 1 against Cassius, awarding his opponent 10 victory points while docking Kael 5. But something changed during that duel. Kael began to see the patterns, the structures, the dance of argument and counter-argument. It wasn't so different from weapon combat, really. Each point was a thrust, each counter a parry, each logical progression a combination attack. The terminology was different. The weapons were words instead of steel, but the fundamental back and forth remained recognizable. As he stepped off the platform, exhausted in a way that no physical battle had ever left him, Mira rushed over with water and concerned questions. Kael waved her off, his attention fixed on Cassius, who was reviewing the judge's notes. "Why did you really challenge me?" Kael asked. "You said you needed another win, but you could have dueled anyone here." Cassius looked up, and for the first time his expression showed something like respect. "Because I needed to know if the rumors were true. They say you were SSS rank in your world. If that's accurate, then you possess something most F-rank students lack. Genuine combat experience at the highest levels. I wanted to see if that experience translated at all to verbal warfare. And do you know what I discovered?" "What?" "That with proper training, you'll be far more dangerous than any of these academic types." Cassius gestured to the other F-rank students watching with mixed expressions of shock and curiosity. They learn rhetoric like it's mathematics, following formulas and memorizing patterns, but you're approaching it like it's life or death, because in your experience, combat always was. That intensity, that focus, if you can channel it through rhetorical forms, you'll advance faster than anyone expects. He offered his hand, a gesture of respect between warriors that transcended world boundaries. I look forward to facing you again when we're both E rank. It should be considerably more challenging by then. Kael clasped the offered hand, feeling calluses that spoke of extensive writing practice rather than sword work. I'll hold you to that. Over the following weeks, Kael threw himself into studying the rhetorical arts with the same brutal dedication that had made him an SSS rank warrior. Where other students attended mandatory classes and called it sufficient, Kael spent every available hour in the library, reading theoretical texts until his eyes burned. He attended optional workshops. He volunteered for extra practice duels, accepting losses as learning opportunities rather than shameful defeats. The Foundation of Rhetoric course proved both easier and harder than expected. Easier because the concepts, once he understood them, followed logical patterns similar to combat tactics. Harder because applying those patterns in real time, while under pressure, while constructing coherent arguments from scratch, demanded a completely different kind of mental agility than he'd ever developed. His instructor, Professor Helena Greystone, was a stern woman in her 60s who'd achieved A-rank status 30 years prior and devoted herself to teaching since. She seemed perpetually disappointed in her students, finding fault with even the strongest arguments. But Kael noticed she spent extra time with those who showed genuine effort, rather than just natural talent. "Mr. Destroyer," she said after class one afternoon, using the title with deliberate emphasis that might have been mockery or might have been acknowledgement. "Your latest essay on the ethics of persuasion shows improvement in structure, but remains hampered by your tendency toward absolute statements. In rhetorical combat, absolutes are weaknesses. They create targets for your opponent to attack." Kael reviewed the paper she'd returned, covered in red corrections and annotations. "You're saying I should hedge my positions? Speak less directly?" "I'm saying you should recognize nuance. The world is not divided into strong and weak, victory and defeat. There are gradients, complexities, contextual factors that influence outcomes. Your warrior background makes you think in binary terms, but rhetoric demands understanding the spectrum between extremes." She pulled out a revised version of one of his paragraphs, showing how absolute claims could be rephrased with appropriate qualification. Instead of "physical training always produces superior combat effectiveness," you might argue, "physical training, when properly conducted and suited to individual aptitudes, frequently enhances combat effectiveness across multiple scenarios, though specific contexts may favor alternative approaches." See the difference? Kael saw it, but every instinct rebelled against such careful, measured language. In battle, hesitation meant death. Direct action won fights. This constant qualification, this endless consideration of alternatives and exceptions, felt like weakness. But he was learning, slowly, painfully, that this world operated under different rules. Here, the appearance of certainty mattered less than the reality of logical soundness. Here, admitting nuance strengthened rather than weakened your position. His first true victory came against a student named Marcus Chen in week 3. Marcus, like Kael, came from a more action-oriented background, though his world valued magical prowess over physical strength. The duel itself was messy, full of minor fallacies on both sides, arguments that barely held together under scrutiny. But Kael managed 3 solid volleys without committing sequential fallacies, and when Marcus attempted an appeal to tradition that Kael successfully identified and countered, the judges awarded Kael his first 10 victory points. The number glowing next to his name in the Academy's ranking system felt more satisfying than any physical trophy ever had. He'd won through intellect, through words, through careful construction of logical arguments that held up under analysis. It was different from the rush of combat victory, but no less meaningful. Mira celebrated with him over dinner in the Academy's dining hall, her enthusiasm infectious. "See? I told you that you could do this. 10 points might not seem like much, but it proves you're learning, adapting, actually mastering the fundamentals." Damien, who'd joined them, added his own analysis. "Your progress is actually quite remarkable. Most cross-dimensional students take at least 2 months to secure their first victory. You're ahead of the curve, which suggests my hypothesis about transferable strategic skills was correct. The question now is whether you can maintain this acceleration as you advance through ranks. E rank and beyond introduce significantly more complex rhetorical techniques." Kael absorbed this information while mechanically consuming food that still tasted strange after weeks in this world. Everything here seemed designed for aesthetic appeal rather than nutritional efficiency. The delicate pastries, the elaborate sauces, the carefully arranged vegetables, none of it felt like real food compared to the simple, hearty meals of his homeland. "Tell me about E rank," he said between bites. "What changes?" Damien pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a well-worn page. E rank introduces compound arguments, linking multiple premises into complex logical chains. You'll also encounter your first rhetorical gambits, which are advanced techniques that can turn a duel's momentum in seconds. Time limits shorten to 15 minutes, judges become less forgiving of minor errors, and your opponents will have significantly more training than F-rank students. How many victory points to reach E rank? 100, same as advancing from F. But the difference is that F-rank students earn points mostly from practice duels against other F-ranks. Once you hit 50 points, the system starts matching you against low E-rank opponents to test your readiness. These matches are brutal. Many students plateau in the 70s or 80s, unable to overcome that transition barrier. Kael's expression hardened with determination. "Then I'll train harder." Mira laughed, but it held a note of concern. "Kael, you're already training harder than anyone else in F-rank. You spend more hours in the library than students have ranked 2 levels above you. If you push yourself any harder, you'll burn out." "I've endured worse. In the Northern Wastes, warriors train for 16 hours daily during preparation periods. I'm only studying maybe 12 hours here." "Mental exhaustion is different from physical exhaustion," Damien interjected. "Physical training follows predictable patterns. You stress muscles, they recover stronger, repeat. But intellectual work doesn't follow the same curve. Past a certain point, additional study time provides diminishing returns. Your brain needs rest to consolidate learning, to process patterns, to build the neural pathways that allow instinctive application of rhetorical principles." The suggestion that rest could be productive rather than wasteful ran counter to everything Kael had learned as a warrior. In his world, the strong trained while the weak slept. Victory belonged to those willing to push past normal human limits. But he'd also learned to recognize when his combat instructors possessed genuine expertise worth heeding. "Fine," he conceded reluctantly. "I'll reduce training to 10 hours daily and spend the additional time in meditation or light reading." Mira and Damien exchanged glances that suggested 10 hours still qualified as excessive, but neither pushed further. They were learning, Kael realized, just as he was. Learning how to interact with someone from a fundamentally different cultural background, someone whose baseline assumptions about effort and achievement operated on scales foreign to their academic experience. The breakthrough came during Week 5, in Professor Greystone's advanced lecture on argument architecture. She was explaining how complex positions could be constructed like buildings, with foundational premises supporting mid-level claims that ultimately upheld the conclusion. "Consider this structure," she said, drawing on the classroom's magical presentation board. "Your foundation might be, all humans require social cooperation to thrive. Your first level claims, social cooperation requires effective communication. Your second level argues, effective communication depends on shared understanding of language. Your conclusion, therefore, becomes, societies that prioritize linguistic education will demonstrate greater overall prosperity. She turned to face the class, her expression challenging. Now, who can identify the potential weaknesses in this structure? Several hands rose, including Cassius, who'd attended this lecture as preparation for his imminent advancement to E rank. But Kael's hand rose as well, surprising both the professor and his classmates. Yes, Mr. Destroyer. Kael stood, organizing his thoughts, as he'd learned to do. The Foundation assumes human thriving requires cooperation, but doesn't account for individuals who excel in isolation. The first-level claim fails to distinguish between cooperation quality and cooperation quantity. Two societies might communicate equally effectively, but cooperate to different degrees based on cultural factors. The second level confuses correlation with causation. Shared language enables but doesn't guarantee understanding. And the conclusion contains a false cause fallacy, assuming that linguistic education alone drives prosperity, when numerous other factors might contribute. The classroom fell silent. Professor Greystone's expression remained neutral, but Kael noticed the slight nod, the subtle indication of approval. Comprehensive analysis, she acknowledged. You've identified 4 distinct logical concerns in a structure that appeared sound on initial examination. This demonstrates developing critical thinking skills. However, I would add that your critique itself makes assumptions about individual versus collective thriving that would need justification in a formal debate. Nevertheless, well done. The class continued, but Kael barely heard the remaining content. Something had clicked in his mind. A fundamental shift in how he processed arguments. He could see the structures now, could visualize them like battle formations, could identify where they were strong and where they were vulnerable. It felt, for the first time since arriving in this world, like he might actually belong here. His victory, points accumulated steadily over the following weeks. 35, 42, 53. Each duel taught new lessons, exposed new weaknesses, revealed new aspects of the rhetorical arts he'd never considered. Some victories came easily against unprepared opponents. Others were brutal struggles that left him mentally exhausted for days. At 68 points, the system matched him against his first E-rank opponent, a young woman named Sarah Blackwood, who'd advanced 3 months prior and already earned enough points to be approaching D-rank status. The duel took place in front of a larger audience than Kael had yet experienced, as cross-rank matches drew spectators curious to see if the challenger had true advancement potential. Sarah approached the platform with quiet confidence, her movements graceful and economical. Her opening statement demonstrated why she'd earned E-rank status. I propose that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to create. My opponent, famous now throughout the Academy as the Barbarian, represents a worldview centered on destruction, tearing down enemies, crushing opposition, reducing complex situations to simple victory or defeat scenarios. But consider what such a philosophy cannot achieve. It cannot build lasting alliances, because allies built on fear inevitably betray when opportunity presents. It cannot foster innovation, because creative thinking requires psychological safety to explore ideas without fear of violent reprisal. It cannot establish trust, because trust requires vulnerability that destructive strength actively prevents. Therefore, I argue that my opponent's entire approach to power is fundamentally limited, incapable of achieving the highest forms of human achievement. The argument was elegant, multi-layered, and targeted directly at what Sarah perceived as Kael's core weakness. A month ago, he would have responded with anger, with defensive assertions about strength's value. But he'd learned. He'd grown. When Kael spoke, his voice carried a new quality, not the uncertain stumbling of his early duels, but measured control born from genuine understanding. My opponent constructs a straw man fallacy by misrepresenting strength as purely destructive. But consider this. The strongest warriors in my world were those who knew when not to fight. The greatest generals were those who could inspire loyalty without resorting to force. The most respected leaders were those who used their strength to protect rather than to dominate. Yes, I come from a world that values combat capability. But I also come from a world where strength created the foundation for everything else: commerce, arts, philosophy. By establishing security that allowed such pursuits to flourish without constant threat of annihilation. My opponent claims my worldview cannot build lasting alliances. Yet I stand here today because 2 students offered me friendship and assistance despite having no obligation to do so. These alliances were not built on fear, but on mutual respect and shared purpose. Therefore, her central premise, that strength equals destruction, fails to account for strength as enabler, as protector, as foundation for higher pursuits. Strong counter established fallacy identification, successful argument framework, solid continue current approach. The duel intensified, each volley more sophisticated than Kael's previous matches. Sarah pushed him harder than any F-rank opponent, identifying weaknesses in his reasoning with surgical precision, exploiting gaps in his knowledge of advanced rhetorical techniques. But Kael held his ground, using the combat instincts that had kept him alive through countless battles to read her patterns, to anticipate her next moves, to counter before she could fully develop devastating lines of attack. When the final judgment came, Sarah won on points. Her superior technique and deeper theoretical knowledge gave her the edge. But the margin was close. Closer than most F-rank versus E-rank matches, and the judges specifically noted that Kael's performance demonstrated readiness for advancement. Sarah approached him after the duel, offering a respectful bow. "You fought well, better than I expected from someone still technically F-rank. When you do advance, seek me out. I'd be interested in a rematch when we're on more equal footing." Kael returned the bow, feeling strange performing the gesture but recognizing its importance in this culture. "I look forward to it." Over the next 2 weeks, Kael pushed through the final victory points needed for advancement. At 97 points, he faced a particularly challenging opponent who nearly derailed his progress. At 99 points, he secured an almost effortless victory against a student who clearly wasn't ready for serious competition. And then finally, at 100 points exactly, the notification he'd been working toward appeared. Rank advancement achieved new rank. E-rank apprentice orator, previous rank. F-rank novice advancement. Time, 7 weeks, 3 days. Note, this advancement speed places you in the top 15% of historical student performance. The glowing E-rank symbol replaced the F on his academy robes, a visible marker of progress that felt simultaneously monumental and insufficient. He'd climbed 1 step. Only SSS rank stood 15 steps above him, each one exponentially more difficult than the last. But he'd proven something crucial to himself. He could learn. He could adapt. The skills that made him a legendary warrior could translate to this new form of combat. It would take longer than he wanted, require more effort than seemed reasonable, demand he fundamentally rebuild his understanding of strength and power. But it was possible. Mira threw him a small celebration party, inviting Damien, Cassius, and several other students who'd trained alongside him during those brutal first weeks. They gathered in one of the academy's common areas, sharing food and stories. The atmosphere relaxed in a way that felt foreign to Kael's warrior instincts, but pleasant nonetheless. 7 weeks from F to E, Cassius mused, raising a glass in salute. "I managed it in 6, but I came from a world with at least some verbal tradition. Your accomplishment is arguably more impressive given your starting point." "Don't let it go to your head," Damien added with academic precision. E rank to D rank typically takes 3 to 4 months, and the difficulty scales significantly. You'll need to master compound arguments, learn at least 6 rhetorical gambits, and develop the ability to construct multi-volley strategies, rather than responding reactively to each exchange. Mira rolled her eyes at Damien's compulsive need to educate. Can we just celebrate the achievement without immediately focusing on the next challenge? Kael has made incredible progress. He's earned a moment to feel proud. The group's attention turned to Kael, expecting some acknowledgement or speech. He felt their expectation, recognized the social convention, but struggled to find words that matched the moment's significance. Finally, he simply said, "Thank you, all of you. In my old world, warriors stood alone. Here I'm learning that strength can come from community, from shared knowledge, from people who choose to help you succeed, even when they gain nothing from your victory. It's different, but perhaps not worse." The admission felt like vulnerability, like showing weakness to potential enemies. But these weren't enemies. They were something his old world had never truly taught him to value. They were friends. The celebration continued into the evening, conversations flowing with the ease of people who'd fought beside each other, even if those fights occurred in arenas of discourse rather than on blood-soaked battlefields. Kael found himself actually enjoying the social interaction, a sensation so foreign that he barely recognized it. Later, alone in his room, Kael stood before the mirror, examining his reflection. The E-rank symbol glowed softly on his robe. The massive muscles that had defined him as a warrior remained, though perhaps slightly reduced from months of mental rather than physical training. But his eyes, those had changed most. They held a different kind of intensity now. The focus of someone learning to see battles fought with words, to recognize attacks that came through logical arguments rather than steel blades. He thought about his old world, the northern wastes, the life he'd built through blood and violence. Did he miss it? The question surprised him with its complexity. He missed the clarity, the straightforward nature of physical combat, the simplicity of problems that could be solved by being stronger than your opponent. But he didn't miss the loneliness. Didn't miss viewing everyone as either ally or enemy with nothing in between. Didn't miss the constant vigilance, the knowledge that any moment of weakness could mean death. The exhausting need to maintain dominance through intimidation and force. This world, with its emphasis on intellectual combat and verbal warfare, had taught him something unexpected. Strength didn't always mean standing alone. Power didn't always come from being feared. Victory could be achieved through understanding, through persuasion, through changing minds rather than breaking bodies. He wasn't sure he'd fully accepted these lessons. Old instincts died hard. But he was learning, adapting, growing in ways that went beyond simple skill acquisition. The path to SSS rank stretched long before him. At his current rate, achieving that pinnacle might take years. But time, he was realizing, mattered less than progress. Each rank climbed taught new skills, revealed new understanding, transformed him into something neither pure warrior nor pure scholar but a fusion of both traditions. Kael opened his textbook for the next day's lessons, diving into the complex theory of compound arguments with the same intensity he'd once brought to mastering new weapon forms. The words on the page no longer swam incomprehensibly. He could read them now, understand them, apply them in actual combat situations. Somewhere in the northern wastes, Kael the Destroyer had been an unstoppable force of nature, feared and respected in equal measure. Here, in the Central Kingdoms, Kael the Student was learning to become something potentially even more dangerous, a warrior who fought with words, backed by the strategic thinking that had once made him legendary. The journey had just begun. But for the first time since stepping through that dimensional rift, Kael felt confident about the destination. SSS rank waited. And he would reach it. One carefully constructed argument at a time. If you enjoyed this journey from brutal warrior to strategic orator, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more epic manhwa recaps, where characters face impossible challenges and emerge transformed. Drop a comment telling me which rank system you think is more impressive, traditional SSS rank combat power or SSS rank rhetorical mastery. And if you want to see what happens when Kael faces the Academy's true elite opponents, let me know, and I'll bring you the next chapter of his incredible transformation. Until next time, remember, the strongest weapon isn't always a sword. Sometimes, it's the right words spoken at the perfect moment.